project's on the other side of the river, in what is known as Puxi as opposed to Pudong. And in many ways, the kind of challenge for high-rise building to fit into the city is the flip side. It's somewhat the antithesis of the situation that we face in Pudong. First of all, let's see if we can, there we go. And this represents, by the way, a smattering of projects that KPF has planned and built in Puxi, in this older part of Shanghai. So one of the reasons I say this is the antithesis is that as Bill described Pudong as a place where high-rise buildings are coming out of the ground as master planned, but surrounded by very large void spaces, parks, roads, open areas which perhaps eventually could be filled in Puxi, the entire older city is filled in with a fabric of initially many, many row houses and office buildings which went up perhaps typically to 8 stories or so, with very narrow roads. And now is being, or has been for the past 15, 20 years, retrofitted, modernized, and redeveloped as a place where high-rise buildings can fill in the cracks or find places where tall, even more dense, modern office, residential, and hotel commercial buildings can find a home. So, and this shows you an image of probably from the 1970s or so of Pudong over on the right-hand side in green, almost looking like an agricultural area, which in fact it was, peppered with warehouses. And on the left-hand side, you see the different patchworks of districts of Shanghai. Now, of course, although Shanghai was a fishing village for a number of centuries, the modern city is not really a Chinese city. It's an international city of concessions that were rising from the colonial presence of various, mostly Western powers, and then the Japanese as well. So a French concession, German concession, Russian concession, American, Japanese, and then one international. And so this patchwork gives a very interesting kind of multi-city form to the plan. And then you see further how it develops at the smaller scale. There is a randomness, there is a circumstantial kind of twisting and turning of roads, and part of this comes from the natural occurrence of the Huangpu River, which you see a big wide elbow of on the right-hand side, but then the Suzhou Creek, which winds its way back towards the western part of the city. So this very organic plan of patchworks. And as I was thinking about how and where one could describe the new high-rise buildings came to be in Puxi, it is a little bit like the growth of a weed out of pavement. There were not, so to speak, very regimented master plans. There was a city master plan, but it's had many generations. Instead, it's been much more happenstance and circumstantial. Which moneyed developers managed to get a hold of which sites through some kind of political process, along with, obviously, the power of money? Where were they able to remove the inhabitants? Because resettlement is one of the big costs, which is an impediment to building. Where did the shadow laws, which govern or safeguard the welfare of those living in surrounding residential neighborhoods, where were those configured in such a way that one could put up a tall tower? So it has been very much like weeds growing out of pavement. In this patchwork, we find sprinkles of tall buildings. And the first project which we did in China, and this came as a precursor to the Mori Tower, starting in 1994 as a competition, is the first project I want to talk about, Plaza 66. It is, as you can see, located in this center of a red circle, which is along a very important road in Shanghai called Nanjing Road West, Nanjing Shilu, which is the most traveled commercial road in China, the highest footfall if you measured the number of bicycles, people, cars, shoppers in a very dense city in a country full of big cities. This is the densest. And as we first arrived on the scene, for those of you who visited China in the 80s or 90s, the predominance of the bicycle gave these twisty, windy streets a certain character of fluidity. In fact, walking across the street was a kind of act of walking through water almost. The bicycles never hit you. They were the molecules of water. They flowed around you. And it was best not to look, because if you looked, you stopped, and then you froze, and then you got hit. You closed your eyes and kept going. It was a little bit like a tightrope walker. You just have faith and keep going. But this experience, although maybe a little cliche, we think about China and bicycles in the 80s and 70s, it had a kind of profound influence on our thinking about space and form and movement in this part of Shanghai. The project which emerged, this shows you a finished picture of the building, or almost finished, as it was in about 2001, responded then to the curvature of Nanjing Road, because the road is not an axis, it was not a boulevard, not a Manhattan grid street, but rather a kind of bumpy, windy, twisted, almost a village path that became a major road. And just at the point where it intersected with our building site, it took a little bump and made a grind. And so our building tried to find a way to bring the curvature of the plan of the city into the plan of this mixed-use project, which consists of several tall office building structures, the tallest of which is 300 meters, which just makes it the tallest building in Puxi, in the old city. But then, probably more important to the way that the building functions in the city, at the ground, a large market, which is a retail mall, as we would call it, which has a flow which brings people off the street in a curved arc and then back onto the street. So it's if one talks in terms of fluid dynamics, rivers, streams, it's a tributary which comes off the street. So the building you see here at night, if we can look at the elements, the public spaces below are characterized by semi-pure circular volumes, a truncated cone, a tilted sliced iris, a curved arc bridge, hard to describe lantern form, which comes of the sculpting of circular shields at the top of the building. And so there's kind of a catalog of circular forms. Now, the reason for, or one of the effects of, the choice of these circular geometries and volumes was to try to make this building a spatial building. High-rise buildings tend to be objects like chess pieces on a board, somewhat isolated because of their size, and the requirement that tall buildings be structurally sound, which usually leads to resolved, centered geometric plans. What we tried to do, because we had the advantage of having a couple of buildings and more elements at the base, was to try to get these elements to come together to describe fields of space, zones that either actually could be occupied or could be visually identified, both on the skyline and down below. And if one looked then at the plan of the building with the large public spaces of the market shown here in this iris, here in this cone, and then connected by this arc with the towers behind, those forms and the form of the front facade of the building created a sense of space, which gestured towards a park on the other side of the street. And the axial opening, which was visually experienced from inside this atrium space, focused one on the Chinese Exhibition Center, which is a building which was bestowed upon the Shanghainese Chinese government by the Russians in the period when the two countries were closely allied with each other, and one of the few open spaces in this neighborhood of the Jing'an district. And so this was sort of the focus of these spatial forms of the circular sculpting of the towers and the podium. Then further spaces, and this is taken a little before the completion of the landscape, but up on the top of the roof of the podium, where the curvatures of the plan were felt in skylight forms, and then looking beyond to curvatures in the tower. And similar views of other parts of this amalgam of large massing elements. Then down at the base of the building, we decided that the facade along Nanjing Road would best be created as a masonry facade with a great deal of gravity, density, texture. The stone which clads the building, I'll show you in a minute, is made of a rough tooled, grooved stone almost treated as if a sculptor's chisel was giving it some form, because the vibrance of Nanjing Road in the other parts of the city has always had something to do with the way that facades take light, throw shadow, and then are repositories for signage. But out of that solid base then ruptures this atrium form, one of those semi-pure circular solids. And there you see this stone, which was designed actually as a computer drawing, and then some sort of mechanical process created hundreds of thousands of these stone forms in Fujian province, where the stone came from, but to give this texture to the facade. And inside the building are a series of urban oases, of spaces that are purportedly for shopping, but the point of the developer, and our point in design, was to make places where people could come and spend the day no matter what they were doing. They didn't have to spend a dime, even though some of the most expensive retail in the world is located in this building, and the rates of shopping and the rates of return from such brands as Louis Vuitton are extremely high. At the top of the building is another space which unfortunately is not occupied. It would have been nice to make it, so you have to clamber up there, and I had to do a little bit of mountain climbing to get up on top of a cooling tower to take the photograph. But it's the internal shroud of the lantern, and this is what I described as a series of arced shields coming together to make this unusual sort of polygonal sleeve. But it's interesting because although it funnels the plume of the cooling towers, the mechanical system of the building, the main purpose is maybe the world's largest light fixture. It's maybe 130 feet tall, and its main function is to light up at night. But the power of the symbolism, or the power of at least the phenomenon of something that is that present and that unusual on the skyline, has made this building something of it's a favorite in Shanghai. Down at the base of the building, other transformations or other uses of glass in textured tiles, in translucent ceiling forms, and then as a kind of a vitrine surface to cloak stone behind. That glassiness is explored in ways that make some interesting spaces. The plan of the main tower, and I'm sorry I don't have so many plans and sections to show today, I just haven't included them. But this one's important to show you how huge those columns are. And you can see the columns are the same size as the elevators. That's not quite normal in our practice here in this country. This is not even a super high-rise building. It's sort of a high-rise. But the concrete strength at that time, when the building was built in the early mid-90s, was maybe about half the strength of what we might expect today. And so in order to make sense of or hold up a building like this, tremendous amount of structure was required. And in that structural challenge also, the making of the foundation was an epic in itself. The structure here designed by Thornton Tomasetti, one of our great New York engineers. Dennis Poon was the leader of this design along with Richard Tomasetti. But you can see here the reinforcing bar is so densely packed in this place where first the piles and then the floor slabs had been poured for the basement, that there's almost not enough room for the concrete. And that's because the reinforcing bar was locally procured. It was a very weak steel, and so you needed to have more of it. It actually became more expensive than if you had imported more efficient steel, just because of the quantities involved. So it took on, as we would go and inspect the site, almost an agricultural character. This was like looking at, a Bruegel painting of wheat fields with the farmers tilling collecting the sheaves of wheat. Only it was a high-rise in modern China. Very much a pioneering building from a structural point of view. The stiffness ratio, which is one of the criteria for design of a tower, which regulates the degree to which it would sway in the wind, in particular more than earthquakes. The Chinese codes were very conservative because these buildings had not been done before. This was the tallest building by far in Shanghai. And so conservatism is a natural response when building something which otherwise could be quite risky. So what Dennis Poon had to do was to give a whole series of academic lectures to the experts panels in Shanghai to explain to them why the building should be able to oscillate or to sway more than 1/800th of its height. 1 to 500th would be sufficient to ensure comfort inside and safety outside. And that was a long-fought battle, but referring to Bill's comment about embedded energy, saving material in a high-rise, of course, is in the interest of the economics of the building, but it's also in favor of good environmental practice, less concrete, less material, less curing, and a lower carbon footprint. So the second project I'd like to show you tonight, not our first, one of our latest projects in Shanghai, but very close to Plaza 66. It's in the same district known as Jing'an District because of a little temple which exists very close to this building. And it takes a very different approach to and is a very different reading of the urban fabric. Both of the projects are about, again, how the high-rise makes space and how we look into the plan of the city and find a clue as to what architecture and urban design can do to add to and elaborate on and enrich an existing condition. So what we've done here in these yellow blocks is to take an existing super block, let's call it, because the blocks in Shanghai are much bigger than the blocks we know here in New York. Our blocks here, 200 by 600 by 800. Typical block in Shanghai doesn't really exist in this patchwork, but average, one might say, maybe 800 by 1,000. So this would comprise in New York 5, 6, 7, 8 blocks. But within the block, one finds an articulated, not a system, but again, a sort of a happenstance occurrence of inner alleyways, of inner spaces, and occasionally found spaces that are really of some scale, a small square, or even in some cases, a palace of a building, a major mansion found only on the inside of the block. It's a very different urban structure from what we're used to in the Western city, and saying something about a social and economic and a development culture that existed when these concessions were built primarily, let's say the end of 19th and early 20th century. Now this illustrates to you some of the examples of these lilong, or row housing, inner block experiences. Again, this is not a mapped street. This is not a public way. It's not a place for cars, but it is a public space. It's a place where one can say one's front door leads off of a space that belongs to a small community, but very much variable dimensions, some small, some larger, almost like the circulatory system in a body, where we don't have only rigid hierarchies of arteries, veins, capillaries, but they vary. Or places that become commercial venues, a place where you could sell balls of yarn or DVDs or sell a cup of tea or whatever, but they're found and they're used in interesting ways. And this refers you to a building which actually I believe is found inside a block. So, all of a sudden, from these little capillaries, you come to a space, and there's some scale and some grandeur to it. And somebody's address, somebody's front door away from the street. So this second project, the Jing'an project, works under the assumption that the worst thing one can do put it another way, one of the responsibilities of the architect today in Puxi is to try to either preserve, mimic, reiterate, echo something of those lilong block structures that we know from the concession era, because they give life to the city, because they're interesting, because today's formula of many a Hong Kong developer coming to Shanghai, or many a Chinese developer, to build a big podium that engulfs an entire superblock, and then a tower, and a tower, and a tower, leaves something to be desired. The city ceases to operate in the sense that public space, outdoor space, has been erased and engulfed by private property. So this sort of bit of very fine definition of smaller mini blocks and pathways became the paradigm for the plan of this Jing'an project. This is, in fact, could have been a super block, could have been one giant podium, and instead you see a mixed-use amalgam of taller towers in light blue, lower retail areas in yellow, public transportation, entertainment in red, and main sort of objective here, first objective, was to keep the public space of the street moving through the project. And it shows you an early rendering of the project with these two towers, one being initially a pure hotel, the other being a stacking of an office building below, becoming a more slender building above. Office below and hotel above. And then in the sort of boxes and cubes at the base of the building, which you see rendered in more solid materials, places to shop, places to eat, to be entertained, and some public transport spaces, function rooms, etc. Now this kind of language then of cubes, a bit sort of a complement to the curves which I showed you in Plaza 66, makes a kind of system for the development of this project and a way in which we like to view the city and give it some kind of recurring theme of the way in which elements of building and function are recognized. And those, in fact, could be pulled apart into a catalog. One very nice thing about this approach of this grouping of many different grids and solid volumes is that given the mixed use of the project, we could suit the dimensions of the office building, the 40-foot corridor perimeter, or the hotel dimension, or the broader convention element, or whatever the function might be. So the free collaging of these pieces and the sort of compositional arrangement of them suited the purposes of the mixed-use plan. Now, another aspect of the project which was very important to draw out of this or from this approach was the categorizing or the hierarchy of vertical scales in the city. Puxi and Shanghai can be seen as a progressive layering of scales, starting at the river, at the Huangpu River. Most of you know the view of the Bund with limestone buildings which hit a datum line, not consistent, but somewhere around 50 meters. Then working up in tiers to buildings which historically were erected a little later, which are perhaps 30, 40 meters taller, then middle high-rise buildings up at about 120 meters, and then finally the datum which describes the high-rises of today in Puxi, which top out at about 280 to 300 meters. So there's this progressive layering in the city. You could see it in this image taken probably from the Pearl Tower with a telephoto lens. And then that same sort of tiered scaling up from low to high is inherent in the Nanjing Shilu Jing'an project. So one of the possibilities in a high-rise, but not always achieved, which is to connect the earth to the sky in some way that gives us a scalar clue. It's not a sudden transition. It's not an infinite kind of juxtaposition of 0 to infinity, but rather it's an incremental approach of 0 to 25 meters, which, by the way, the fire departments in Shanghai give as the first podium level datum that has to be observed for most of the podium. The firemen actually have to get up on ladders to the podium roof. So that's our first clue. And along with the increments of massing, we decided that these buildings would best be articulated in their facades, in their modules, by grid systems, which carefully and in a regular way also met this kind of gradation of different scales. So the base of the tower, the main sort of double tower or office and hotel tower, where you see this cubic element here, that is articulated by a supergrid of exoskeletal columns and beams, which is 4.5 meters wide, 9 meters tall. And then working our way up to much smaller grid articulations, which worked well for a hotel building, where 4.5 meters would be the normal increment between the walls of partitions of a hotel room. So now the purity or the perfection of a grid, which does not exist in the overall composition, is something we do bring in this project to every piece of the building. So we recall here the Sol LeWitt cube sculpture, because there is something, I think, for us New Yorkers inherently urban about the grid. It's of course, Cartesian grids started somewhere else in the world, but we've found a way in the U.S. to make them the kind of underpinning of our cities, and they serve us very well. There's a flexibility in the grid, and there's almost, for this project, a kind of religion that we have to stick with the grid. Nothing falls off line, because within this compositional chaos, there must be some system. And then it all works very well, because column lines and facades and pathways and parking all work. So this is the closest thing I'll show you tonight of a plan of the building, which looks like a series of patterns. But it is a kind of informed set of orders, which then generate the column lines and the spaces and modules and so on. And then in the facades, partly for the sake of compositional efficiency and partly for the sake of cost, and maybe for the efficiency of the use of materials, each of the facades falls along the pattern of a number of modules which are multiples of each other. So when they meet in a clean fashion. There is a kind of rhyme and reason to the way that structure and facade work together in a whole catalog of many pieces of the building. And you can see here how that catalog is then related to, as a form of illustrations of patchwork, relates to different pieces of this glass wall facade. By the way, talking about the use of glass, the use of solid, which is a subject of a long lecture, and I'm almost done here, so I won't get too far into it, but I think we all appreciate the beauty and lightness of glass and the function inside a building of having a lot of light. And yet, for a city to be all glass leaves something to be desired. So in Shanghai, there is now a backlash against the use of glass. There are regulations which prevent one from using either too much glass or glass with too much reflectivity. So the use of the grid at this point is to provide, in some cases, a metal veil which is placed over the glass as an exoskeleton or a scrim or a cage to soften the appearance of the glass and to keep those reflections from being too harsh. And then down at the base, we revert from the glass to actually to solid materials of terracotta, of metals, stone. And one piece of the building is a store, which is just a perfect grid. So that is our Sol LeWitt. So to finish up, one last and curious and interesting fact of the project is that in the middle sits what you see here shown as a colored little monopoly house. That's a house where Mao Zedong lived as a young man. And so at the core of this sort of Rockefeller Center is the house where the great leader lived. And the Hong Kong developer impresario Robert Kwok Shangri-La, who can see his great monuments of commerce go up. They're all, in a sense, in service to this landmark. And then, and this would be the equivalent, let's say, of the skating rink in Rockefeller Center. And it'll be very interesting to see. We don't know how it's going to be used for his calligraphy, Mao's calligraphy, an exhibit. Will it be a tea house? Will it be full of tchotchkes of Mao watches? We're not quite sure. More important for us is to understand the way people will interact with the scale of space, the scale of these boxes that ascend up again from the ground to the 280 meters to make a town square in the middle of Shanghai. And that's it. Thanks.